This paper is part of an ongoing project that I have with some co-authors about how to better measure and understand corruption. And the specific theoretical take that this paper offers is a little bit different from the standard way of approaching this as political scientists, is to look at firms as actors and players in this corrupt exchange and firms as potential initiators of the corruption, so trying to understand the utility function of firms in corruption as well as of the gatekeepers. So that's where this paper takes off. That this paper starts off from. Let me just say right now at the beginning that the paper is a little bit technical, and because it's technical, and go ahead and ask questions all along the way. There's no need to be polite. Economics rules are fine. So if you don't understand something or want to understand something better ask it right away, because then the next set of slides will probably be incomprehensible. So we might as well just cover and move on sort of incrementally. All right, so here's the motivation for the paper. I was at a conference on 20 years of economic reform in Vietnam, and there were two very famous Vietnamese scholars there. Some of you may know Ngo Vinh Long. He's a historian at the University of Maine. He's really associated with the reform movement in Vietnam. And he said this about the reform period. Huge concentrations of money, especially from foreign sources, have been at the roots of many arbitrary decisions of the Vietnamese state. And I found that really striking and pretty depressing thing to say. Then he was followed up by a guy named Vu Quang Viet. Vu Quang Viet is a Vietnamese-American economist who worked at the UN, but was part of something, for those of you who know Vietnam, which was Vo Van Kiet's Saturday Group. And the Saturday Group was a group of economists who would meet with Vo Van Kiet as he was planning the Doi Moi economic reforms. And so Vu Quang Viet is often associated with some of the big initiatives of the Doi Moi renovation reforms. And he said this, something even more critical: this has helped me make Vietnam more dynamic, capable of attracting more foreign direct investment, opening up the economy outwardly and generating much more wealth, and thus offering more spoils for abuse and bribery, which have reached an unprecedented scale under the current regime. So once again, for him, it was openness that had led to this corruption. Not that corruption had been there before, but that openness was actually exacerbating the corruption in Vietnam. So I found that really intriguing, and the reason why I found it intriguing was because the literature about openness and corruption in the social sciences, particularly in political science, has made the prevailing wisdom has made almost the exact opposite argument. And that argument goes like this. So the argument they've made is it's actually openness drives down corruption, and the reason why it does is through two mechanisms. One is a pure competition mechanism, that once you open up to international trade or foreign direct investment, that the rents that are available will be driven down. So because those rents are driven down, because there's more competition for rents, then there's less to bribe for. So we should see less corruption once you see openness. A second argument is sort of a political diffusion argument. And here, this is where foreign direct investment really comes in. Garian and Thacker have been big on this point, is that when you open up an economy and foreign investors come there, then domestic investors can learn from the best practices of those foreign companies. And there's a specific link here made to what's called the U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, that U.S. companies are forbidden and can actually be punished domestically for engaging in bribery abroad. And so as a result, they hold themselves to a very strict standard, and that standard diffuses through their employees, through their business partners, and so we should see reduced corruption through openness there. So that's the second mechanism that you often see talked about in the literature. And both of them give the opposite prediction of what these Vietnamese economists were experiencing. Now, this is the prevailing view, but it's not the only view. So there is a very strong literature coming from economics and from the political economy side that uses the exact same data and makes the opposite argument. So they make the argument that corruption deters investment. So they find the same correlation, low corruption, high investment, but they say it's because it's the causalities backwards. What I find really amazing about this is that both sets of this literature use the same instrument, which is population density. For those, which is really how they can make separate arguments using the same identification strategy is amazing. But there's that. There's a second argument that says that openness actually increases corruption, and here the idea is that it can actually it can actually increase rents. This is sort of the argument that the Vietnamese were saying, is that there's more money in the system, things are worth a lot more, and so as a result, you want to bribe to get in there more. So as rents increase. Now notice there, and this is, I think, is really important, is that we should expect, if this is true, we should expect variation across sectors. Some sectors are high rent sectors, some sectors are low rent sectors, and we're going to try and take advantage of that a little bit. And then there's a more nuanced literature that says there's a conditional relationship between openness and corruption, that it really has to do with the existing institutions in the domestic economy. And so when the foreign investors or open trade interacts with these institutions, that it can have differential effects. So good institutions will lead to, will actually lead to less corruption if there was good institutions there to begin with. Okay. So that's the prevailing literature. The problem is, I think, as sort of an applied micro researcher here, who's really interested in individual firm level decisions, there are some big problems with the way this has been argued. So the major data that's used in these arguments comes from one of two sources, but either people are working on big aggregate data sets, using, for example, Transparency International or the World Bank's control of corruption measures, which are themselves aggregates of individual level surveys. Or they're working on survey data themselves, where they're asking firms questions about bribery or corruption. And what you tend to notice in all these questions, either the questions themselves that are used as the dependent variables, or in the questions that are aggregated into the World Bank and Transparency International indices, is some key biases from survey design that you see. So first of all, there's sort of the standard problem of us using a Likert scale to measure corruption when you have perception biases and people are going to answer somewhere on the scale differently, which has a lot to do with personality or culture, which could be clustered, right? So the key problem here is what we call anchoring bias. People understand corruption differently. So the classic example of this is nepotism corruption. We'll go around the world and ask people whether hiring a relative is corrupt, and you'll get very different answers. So in fact, if you were to ask some people in Vietnam whether nepotism is corruption, they would make the opposite argument. Nepotism is required. How dare you get a government job and not help out friends and family? Right? So you're going to get different answers to this depending on what people have in their mind when they're answering these questions about corruption. There's also a serious bias that is strongly correlated with institutions, which has to do with how people respond to their own culpability. Often corruption is an illegal act. You're asking to someone to admit to an illegal act, and the screening that goes into the question really matters here. If they believe that they'll be punished for revealing that information, you're going to get a very different answer. And where they believe they're more likely to be punished for revealing information is going to be correlated with institutions. So we got a big problem there. All right. So what survey researchers often do is then they'll do something a little bit different. You've probably seen it or answered a question like this. They say, project away from yourself. So don't tell me about you, but tell me about a firm like yours. Okay. So what happens here is the firm is asked to really talk about themselves, but not admit to it. Right. So tell me about a firm like yours. But what happens with the wording of this question is it invites a lot of hearsay. Say, for example, I live in a community where there was a serious corruption act. Everybody knew about it. And I interviewed the 10 firms like that in that community. Only one was actually involved. All 10 are likely to respond positively. So we can invite some larger answers here. Okay. So all these problems cause some serious errors for inference in how we understand the prevailing literature. So Dan Treisman has done some really interesting work on this, where he looks at questions about perceptions of corruption, so the standard questions that I told you about, tell me about corruption in your area, and then asked about actual corruption. Did you pay a bribe? Now, one, they're not correlated at all. There appears to be no relationship to perceptions of corruption and actual corruption. But two, 90% of the variation in perceptions of corruption is explained by level of economic development and institutions. But those variables have no effect at all on actual corruption. Of course, there's problems with the way the actual corruption question was answered, but that's really enlightening because it tells you that the errors in corruption are correlated with institutions and economic development, which is probably what's leading to these strange results that we're getting. So to go technical for a little while, this is what we call systematic variable measurement error. where the error in your measurement of the dependent variable is actually correlated with your x. So when you find an association between x and y, what you're really uncovering is the correlation in the error terms, okay? All right, and there's some, as I said, there's some telltale signs of this. One of the big telltale signs that you can see is that there's actually big differences when people are, say, they're studying the same thing using aggregate data or firm level data. Okay. A secondary issue that we encounter in the corruption data is this, that corruption actually manifests itself in a number of ways in a society, right? But the standard questions about corruption don't really capture this very well. So for example, they'll ask about corruption, how much of the standard World Bank question is, how much of corruption is an obstacle for businesses like yours? So it doesn't help us differentiate between two types of corruption that we know are really important. Petty corruption, so how much an individual business or an individual pay when they're registering or doing basic licensing, as opposed to grand corruption, right? Kickbacks on land contracts, government procurement. So these are big differences, and in a research project, when we're talking about the mechanism, we're interested in the specific mechanism to the specific type of corruption that's being asked. So these general questions that obfuscate what actual corruption we're experiencing are really problematic for some of the questions we're asking, especially when it comes to openness. All right. Okay, so in our paper, and I'll let you guys read it to get into more detail, but here's what we do. We make three theoretical refinements to generate some hypotheses that we can bring to the data. So as I said, one, we're going to allow for the possibility that foreign firms are complicit in bribery. That foreign firms, when they enter a domestic economy, they have interest in being at that economy, and they're going to make decisions about whether bribing is beneficial to them or not. Two, so the second thing we're going to do is we're going to focus on two particular forms of openness. So one thing I'm going to do is compare foreign to domestic firms and see how they respond to the same set of incentives. And then two, I'm going to look at the removal of administrative barriers to registration. And here, Vietnam is really nice here because Vietnam has had what's called Group A projects, which require a special prime minister's signature for getting approval. And over time, industries have been pulled off of this restricted list. So as a result, we can sort of get leverage on openness sector by sector. In fact, at the 4-digit level. So we can pull this apart and see exactly how different sectors matter. The reason why that's important is because what I want to do is allow a sectoral level effect. So I want to deal with this two-way tango. Foreign firms are more likely to bribe if they can enter sectors where there's a lot of profitability available, there's high rents available in the sector. Gatekeepers are also more likely to know they can ask for corruption in those sectors. So for example, if you want to enter telecommunications and there's one license available for telecommunications, bribery makes a lot more sense than if you want to enter manufacturing, where the margins are really low, you can always go somewhere else. And so there's no reason, it's not economical for you to pay a bribe in that industry, and it also is not economical for the gatekeeper to ask. Okay, so that generates three hypotheses. One, the propensity of foreign firms to bribe is going to increase with the economic rents in that sector, so we'll measure that. And the removal of investment restrictions over time will reduce economic rents in a particular sector and reduce the willingness of foreign firms to bribe. That's what we're going to tease out here. So get some specific hypotheses where the literature has been a little bit opaque. Okay, now, here's the big innovation of this paper that's a lot of fun. So I don't know, are many of you familiar with the unmatched count technique or the list question in survey design? So this is really cool. It comes from psychology. And here I want to deal with this problem of the issue that people are unlikely to reveal information that is illegal. And I want to deal with the perception bias in asking about corruption, which they haven't actually participated in. I want to get their revealed preference. I want to know whether they actually engaged in a behavior or not. Okay, so what I'm going to use is a question called unmatched count technique. And the way this works is you divide your sample randomly into two groups. One group is going to get a list of 3 innocuous, non-sensitive items. So for example, I'll show you for example, but if we were let's say that we were testing our students and we wanted to know if our students cheated on an exam. The way this would work is 1/2 of the students would get asked 3 non-sensitive items. In the past semester, did you study in a study group, right? Did you seek extra help from a study center? 3, did you hire a private tutor, all right? So they get 3 non-sensitive items that might have helped them on the test. The other group is going to get those 3 non-sensitive items, plus they're going to get the sensitive item. Did you cheat, all right? Now, what happens here is they're never asked to admit to any one question. They never have to admit to any one item. They're simply asked, how many of these items did you engage in? Okay? So what happens is, just to give you the clean example, if everybody did all of those things, then I'm going to get an average of 3 over here and an average of 4 over here. So the difference in the means is 1 or 100% engaged in the corrupt activity. So I can make estimations, and then it can range anywhere between 0 and 1. So I can get an estimate of the probability of engaging in a sensitive activity by just comparing these means. The nice thing about it is no one ever has to admit to the sensitive activity. Yeah?
Question. Don't you have to have something that's highly improbable on both lists, because otherwise 4...
Right. It's actually a really fine dance. One has to be highly improbable, but they also can't not be all too probable, because either way you're going to get a floor or a ceiling effect. And any time the respondent is going to be feeling like they're forced into an answer, right, on the sensitive group. So one of the tests that I'll show you in a second is you have to make sure when you're piloting this that you don't have ceiling or floor effects in the control group. And then you can do it. But if anyone's ever forced into a 4 or a 3 or a 0 in the control group, you got big problems. All right. So I'll show you some diagnostics for that. I'm going to just put these up here. People have been experimenting with ways to ask sensitive questions. And this one here, which we call the unmatched count, does really well compared to other things called the randomized response or asking the question directly. Randomized response is flipping a coin. I'll talk about that in the question and answer. But the unmatched count technique does really well. It's understood. It tends to be the most understood. Tends to be the most highly trusted. Is really easy to administer in the field. This having people flip coins or look at banknotes causes all sorts of problems with your interviewers and has the lowest non-response. So it's in these laboratory experiments to test it, it's the one that's been the most useful, which is the one why I like it. So here's the actual question we asked. We asked a whole bunch of these in the survey, but this is the one I'm going to highlight today. So this is to get at petty corruption. So it says, take a look at the following list of activities that firms engage in to expedite the steps needed to receive the investment license. How many of these activities did you engage in when fulfilling any of the business activities listed previously? And there was another part, which is don't tell us each individual one, just tell us the whole amount. So one group got followed procedures for the business license on the website. 2, hired a local consulting firm to obtain the license for you. And 3, looked for a domestic partner who was already registered. And then the sensitive item is here, paid an informal charge to expedite procedures. So did you pay an informal charge to expedite procedures? Now, some of you, I imagine, are already thinking this. I know how foreign firms work. Foreign firms rarely do this, but what they do is they hire the local consulting firm. The local consulting firm gives them a non-itemized receipt, and the foreign firm, the consulting firm just internalizes the bribe, right? That's how American companies have been getting around the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act for years. That's true. That's exactly why this is in here. I'm going to go for the lower bound on direct corruption, but this is a difficult thing for domestic firms to do. So since I'm going to compare the differences between foreign and domestic firms, it doesn't matter that the mean for foreign firms is going to be higher. What matters is the difference between the control and treatment group in both categories. So I'm just going to raise the mean by just taking this out of the equation. So I'm just going to get a lower bound on corruption in that case. All right, so how do we do this? Survey of 7,300 domestic private enterprises and 1,200 foreign direct enterprises in Vietnam. Took place in the summer of 2010. It's part of an annual survey I do in Vietnam called the Provincial Competitiveness Index Survey. The list questions, several list questions were embedded in the survey. Just as an aside, PCI data is really awesome. We have panel data on 1,000 firms going back 6 years, 10,000, about 10,000 firms a year, and the data's all available. So if you ever want to study it, ask me for the data. So, all right. So the response rate overall on the survey was 35%. So now, if you talk to people at business schools, this is really high for a CEO survey. Okay. but you still have to be worried, because it does mean that 7 out of 10 people did not answer the survey, and there's going to be some selection effects into the survey. So one of the things that we have to do in the paper, which I won't bore you with, is make sure that our sample is actually reflective of the population on observables, and hopefully that tells us that it's reflective of the population on unobservables. We also had 30% item non-response, which means that the respondent skipped this particular list question. That's actually a bigger problem, because it actually means that we open up a pathway to this question that was not designed for. So in this particular case, we actually have to engage in something called multiple imputation to deal with this item non-response. Yeah?
These are all self-administered?
These are all self-administered surveys, and self-administered and completely anonymous, actually. So so the respondent gets it, and the demographic information on the respondent is separated from the survey. So there is confidentiality involved. Yeah.
What's your overall non-response to questions on this survey? Higher or lower than 30%?
Yeah. So you mean sort of the average item non-response?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean there are other questions. There's other questions on the survey that have higher item non-response. For example, profitability. It gets higher item non-response, but then there's questions that have very low item non-response too. For example, the age of the business or when it was registered. So I'm not sure. So this question is about par for the course on questions that ask somewhat sensitive material. It wasn't more sensitive than the others, but. Okay, so this is what's, once again, I'm not going to bore you with this. I'm just going to put you up. This is called a balance table, just to show you that the control and treatment groups on basically all of the observables that we can think of are pretty balanced. The reason why this is necessary here, balance tables are very controversial in survey experiments. The reason why a balance table is necessary here is we're worried about non-systematic attrition, that the people in the treatment group might have been more likely to opt to not respond to the question than the people in the control group. And then we would get non-balance that was a result of the experiment. So it's really important that we check this afterwards. So differential rates of attrition on the survey. All right, so here's the bottom line. This is for overall. So, and as I said, we're going for the lower bound here on corruption. So it might be a little bit higher. But there's the control. The treated group has 1.88 items. The control group has 1.65. Those two numbers are statistically different, right? So we know that there's a meaningful difference between control and treatment group, and then the difference between the means there is 22.9%. So that's the lower bound of corruption in Vietnam. This is 23% of firms are paying bribes when they register. Well, how does it differ between foreign and domestic? Well, it's about 21% of domestic firms and about 18% of foreign firms are paying bribes when they register their businesses. So now these don't add up, as you probably noticed, to 23. That's because when you do it, you're not taking the difference in between foreign and domestic, right? So that's why you have them. They're a little bit lower in both cases. Yeah.
I'm sorry. What's your N here?
So the N of this is with multiple imputation ends up being 7,500 firms.
I was wondering why the confidence intervals.
Yeah, they're small. Yeah, it's a large group, which is why this is a nice. I'm gonna have to subdivide the data in multiple ways, so I'm gonna take advantage of those degrees of freedom. Here's you asked about the ceiling and floor effects. You can see that we were really careful to not. Nobody got forced into a 0, and very few people got forced into a 3. So that's why we have so few 4s, right? Most people are ending up somewhere in the middle. And it would be a really big problem if I saw a huge spike in 3s here. So, and I actually I've done these in other contexts and totally messed this up. So in case I have all sorts of little tips for how to administer these in the field if you're wondering. Okay, so that's how we're going to measure bribery. That's our dependent variable, which is we're going to take advantage of the difference between these control and treatment groups. Now what I want to do is I want to explore differential openness, and I want to explore it at the 4-digit ISIC code. So this is just a sample from what we have, but here's a list of sectors, and then these are all sectors that required prime minister's approval to enter that sector. So you needed a special signature from the, not necessarily from the prime minister, but from the prime minister's office in order to get a license to enter that sector. And that was true for both foreign and domestic firms. So, and you can see all these sectors are restricted, but then over time, when Vietnam joins the US bilateral trade agreement, we get some movement. Then when Vietnam signs the Common Investment Law in 2005, some of those sectors drop off. WTO entry knocks off a few more. And so we're going to take advantage of this differential movement in the 4-digit ISIC code in particular sectors over time. So these sectors are going to be really, it's not impossible to enter, but you can enter them. And then once these are removed, everything's done at the province level now. You don't need prime minister approval. And so we're taking away a node that's possible for corruption. So the other thing here is too, these restrictions create rents. I'll prove this to you in a second, but when these restrictions are here, then entering that sector becomes highly profitable because you're basically guaranteed a monopoly in that sector, whether it's telecommunications or mining or whatever. So just to prove to you, this is what's called a Herfindahl index. Are you guys familiar with a Herfindahl index? So this is just taking what is the market dominance in a particular sector, and here what I've done is over time put whether a sector was restricted or not restricted. And you can see that over 25 is considered to be, when I worked at the Department of Justice, that's when we got scared, that was enough market dominance to manipulate prices and things like that. So we're looking at market dominance. You can see throughout the period, HHIs are much higher in the restricted sectors. Now, you guys, so of course, HHIs are also a function of the type of industry that you're in, right? So certain industries are just going to lend themselves, they're natural monopolies, or it's more, so we have to control for capital labor ratio in those sectors. So even when we do that, so here's just a regression that shows you even when we do that, restricted sectors still have HHIs that are about 10 or 11% higher. Now, it's also, and here we have to get into a big problem. Obviously, selection of these sectors is not random, right? So even though, now, the sectors are going, we're removing sectors all in one direction. You never get a sector added, which is nice. Sectors only get removed. So it's there. We don't have endogenous regulation in the sense that new regulations are added to protect industries. But of course, the selection of which ones comes off the list are important. So what we do here is take advantage of the legacy of the Vietnamese state-owned economy. And so the argument we make in the paper is certain sectors were protected because these were sectors that were dominated by the state sector, by Vietnam's formerly central planned economy. So what we're going to do is instrument by that state sector and say it's that legacy of state-owned enterprise dominance which drives the regulation. So it's not item specific. It doesn't have to do with bargaining at the elite level. It just has to do with this historical dominance of the state sector. And when we do that, that reduces the difference a little bit, but still not too bad. What you're going to see is that, and with year fixed effects, the difference between restricted sectors in HHI is about 9%, and in terms of profit margin, that means that these sectors also profit margins tend to be about 1.2% higher. So profit margin is difficult to deal with because different things affect profit margin, but these firms also tend to be significantly more profitable, though substantively not too much. Okay, so bottom line is that these restrictions, even if we come up with an identification strategy for these restrictions, restricted sectors tend to be more profitable. So the bottom line is foreign firms that want to enter these sectors should be more likely to bribe to get into them. Okay. Now, I'm going to use a technique here. So you saw these differences in means. But the differences in means are enlightening, but what we want to do is more than that. We want to know the covariates of the corruption, right? I want to know what factors are associated, not just foreign firm, but I want to hold constant the sector that the firm's operating in. I want to hold constant the size of the firm. So I'm going to use a technique. It's called the list method. It's from Kosuke Imai at Princeton. And the way you do it is essentially, the way you handle this model is essentially to the way you handle the difference in means. So it's a two-stage model. And what I'm going to first do is model the determinants of non-sensitive items. Okay, so I run a regression and I find out what is correlated with the non-sensitive items in my list of covariates. Then I'm going to save those predicted values from the non-sensitive items for each firm. So I'm going to have, for each firm, including the firms in the treatment group, I'm going to estimate what is the likelihood, what is the number of non-sensitive items that you would have engaged in. Okay? Then I'm going to take their actual number of items that they answered, and then in the second stage, I'm going to subtract those two and estimate that difference, essentially the difference between treatment and control at the individual level. Okay? It's a two-stage model, so I got to bootstrap the standard errors, and there's some other little bells and whistles, but that's essentially what I'm doing is taking that difference in means and then applying it to each firm. So we're going to take we're going to estimate that average differences across these groups. All right, and here's the everybody hates to look at regression tables, but here's what we find. So if we look, that first model shows you no difference between foreign and domestic firms on average. That we don't see, foreign firms are not more or less likely to engage in corruption. And in fact, there appears to be less corruption in the restricted industries. So this is, entering the restricted industries, there appears to be less corruption. Now, then what I'm going to do is in this next model, interact the two. So I'm going to try and pull apart, okay, let's look at when foreign firms enter a restricted industry versus when domestic firms enter a restricted industry. And there you can see that effect is monstrous, right? It gets really big. That interaction effect is really huge. I'll show you the substantive effects of that in a second. But what I want to show you is that we're going to subject this to controlling for a series of covariates, size of the firm, whether it's a former state-owned firm or not, a measure of optimism, whether the firm planned to expand its business, whether it's in a city or not, and then even add some fixed effects later. It's a pretty robust effect. So bottom line is this. When all variables are held constant at their mean, foreign firms attempting to enter restricted sectors have a 31% predicted probability of engaging in bribery. Okay? 31%. Now what's more interesting though is that's 14% higher than their domestic competitors in the exact same industry. Right? They're trying to enter the same industry. They're more likely to bribe than their domestic competitors, and they're 19% more likely to bribe than foreign firms in the non-restricted sectors. So there is this effect that so when foreign firms are looking to enter a sector, they make a profitability calculation, what are the rents in that sector, and then they determine whether bribes are reasonable or not. And as I said, this is probably an underestimation because foreign firms bribe in other ways that are difficult to measure. So it's robust to a whole bunch of things, including doing this non-imputation-wise and some other techniques for handling this type of question. Now, but what we deal with in an appendix in the paper is foreign investors also differ by type, which is interesting. So, and there's a set of firms that are subject to something like the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which is the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention. So we also spend some time looking at OECD versus non-OECD firms. And what we find is that we get this same effect. OECD firms are also likely to bribe when entering restricted sectors, just the magnitude's a little bit lower. And in terms of other things like foreign 100% FDI versus JVs, we don't find a difference. Between joint ventures, we don't find much of a difference. Industrial zone tends to matter a little bit for non-restricted firms. Okay, now what I've done so far is it was just cross-sectional. Now let's take advantage of the year that the firm entered. So we know that the year the firm entered, so we can actually look at the removal of a sector, the removal of the restriction in that sector over time. And what you can see here is that if we take all the years before WTO entry, that effect is massive. So foreign firms, before those restrictions were removed, were bribing at a very high likelihood. Now, after WTO, not only does WTO remove sectors, but foreign firms are not even bribing in the restricted sectors, which is strange. So, and I don't totally understand the reason for this. I have some ideas. We can talk about it. Here, to make that comparison more fair, because we've only been out of the WTO for 3 years, I'm just going to compare it to the 3 years before WTO entry, and we still see that effect. And this last model here is runs four-digit code fixed effects. So what I'm going to do here is just look at, within a particular industry, what happened when you remove the restriction. The coefficients are kind of backwards here because keep in mind you're only removing restrictions, you're not adding them. So this means this is when you have a restriction. So if you remove that restriction, you reduce corruption in the among foreign firms and restricted sectors by 12.5%. Now notice, this is also really interesting, that domestic firms, we see the opposite effect on domestic firms. So while foreign firms, the bribery goes down, it goes up in domestic firms. Yeah?
Do you think there's a possibility that companies aren't necessarily bribing less, they're just hiding it better? Now that that's
The technology of bribery has improved?
Or, well, they feel there's more pressure to kind of funnel that money and launder it through local firms.
I hadn't thought of that. It's a really interesting question. I like it. And one thing I can do is actually see whether over time people are more likely to hire consulting firms. Yeah, I really like that. That's a really nice check. I hadn't thought of it, but yeah, it's a good one. Yeah, I like it. Yeah.
Now, I have a thought that may reconcile your previous finding that foreign companies are bribing more than the locals, and your findings in this table. That is, before WTO, there are a lot of politically connected companies that do not rely on bribes to get things done, right? They are affiliated with Europe and networks, so they're still corrupted, but they don't rely on bribes per se. But after WTO, because of the forced liberalization and so on, there's more privatization. So those kind of political ties may be weakened as a result. They use bribes more.
I think that is exactly right. I think that's exactly what's going on. That before there's these different technologies that you use to get things done. Right, so foreign firms use bribery, other firms are using relationships. You mess that up, and so foreign firms are now less likely to bribe, but now these domestic firms that were protected by these restricted sectors, now they find themselves having to really compete to get into these licensed industries, and then they have to adopt corruption. So they've lost that capital that they had with the relationship. So I think it's totally right, it's just a hypothesis, and so I've designed an entire research project to see if I could figure that out. But I think it's exactly right. So here's the bottom line results and this really intriguing, as I said, this really intriguing finding that we're more likely to see corruption in domestic firms. So this is just going to map it out for you. This is these differences over time. So for all years, this is the difference between foreign firms in restricted versus non-restricted sectors. And you can see that pre-WTO 3 years, and then after WTO we see nothing. And then this is foreign versus domestic firms, pre-WTO, pretty high. Actually, just before the WTO, we see a lot more, and then we see nothing here. So that the difference declines to 0 between these two. So bottom line here is that I think, like, in some ways that I do a disservice to a lot of people in the way I frame this paper, because in a lot of ways, this paper doesn't really say anybody's right or wrong. In fact, what we just find is that there's just a much more nuanced story here going on. And the first most important part is, I think this is particularly important for political scientists who are really interested in country-level determinants of corruption, that openness has differential effects on corruption, even within the same country and the same institutional setting over time. That we're going to see it in different industries, and we really need to take that into account when we understand these large aggregate indices. Two, I think it's important to remember foreign firms, sometimes if you read the IPE literature, you get confused about this, and foreign firms are just victims of corruption, where I think that we really need to have, as we start in this paper, a better utility function for the decisions foreign firms make about corruption. Foreign firms aren't necessarily victims. They actually appear willing to bribe, and they calculate when it's in their interest to bribe. And so in lower rent industries, then there's also no positive or negative effect to foreignness. And then what we do find here that's interesting is subjecting a country to globalization in the most, and I think one problem that we encountered when we dealt with this literature is a lot of people measure exposure to globalization by something that's entirely endogenous, which is, say, for example, trade flows or FDI flows. But it's really hard to know here what's causing the globalization versus not. So we try and step it back to the actual policy movement, which is still, even then, we've got some problems with endogeneity, but at least it's closer to the actual mechanism. When you subject an economy to openness by removing policies, we do see that it can have some positive effects here. as the literature would say, about actually removing corruption. But of course, it's a highly differentiated effect, and there is this issue that the corruption is, we actually see divergent effects between foreign and domestic firms. All right, thank you very much. So I'm open to questions, so fire away.